Have you ever met someone that just seemed unbreakable? Like, no matter what life threw at them, they would just bounce back better every single time. In Straight Up, rugby legend Ruby Tui explores how she overcame the trials and tribulations of a complicated childhood to go on to represent New Zealand and ultimately become an Olympic gold medalist. But how does she do it? By embracing her background, by maintaining really high standards for herself, and also by creating a strong support system. Let's get into it. So one thing that stood out to me about Ruby was the fact that she embraced her eclectic upbringing. She was half Samoan and half white, a mixture between British and Kiwi, and had experiences with both of her cultures growing up. She moved around a lot as a child, and on page 35, she says that she got the best of both worlds and knows both cultures on both sides, which was the foundation of her really um, expansive and adaptable identity. On page 44, she also acknowledges the other side of this, though. She says that it didn't take long for me to figure out that there were some real huge ways my two worlds were different from each other. And then goes on to explain the differences in food, in culture, in structure, in education, in love, and in discipline. But what's interesting is that she doesn't demonize either side. She just acknowledges that they're both different. On page 50, she says, on page 50, she says that there's always more than one way of seeing things. So living in different family structures, living in different cultures, gave Ruby a perspective that most people don't have to develop. And it meant that she saw people with grace rather than with judgment. For example, she discusses her dad and his abuse and his alcoholism, and she explores her mum's love of books, but also the tendency to date violent men. And she sees them as the complex beings that they are, as opposed to reducing them to simplistic, um, reducing them to oversimplifications. And as well as this, there weren't that many steady adults in her life over time. She does mention a couple, like Auntie Tala. In the book, there's a bit where she says Auntie Tala was sometimes the only real adult in the room. And she also discusses Uncle Neil on page 89. And she seemed to like Uncle Neil. She said it was good to see someone have a vision, working, getting it done, understanding about money. It was so cool to me. So here, Uncle Neil was a bit of an inspiration as well. But in general, there weren't that many steady adults, and they were just kind of scattered sporadically throughout her life. She says on page 63 that she didn't really have people that she could rely on. So, yes, page 63. There was no adult I could rely on, no support or validation coming from any of my relationships. Oof. She says, I loved my mum, but I felt like I couldn't rely on her for anything. And then on her dad, on page 29, she says, Dad loved me and I never doubted that, but just because someone loves you, it doesn't mean they know how to love you. And she reiterates this again on page 262. So she just didn't seem to have many reliable, steady adults around her for an extended time period. And this likely contributed to the independent streak that stuck with her until adulthood. That said, she does speak really well of her Samoan family, of the love and the hugs and the laughter and the warmth. And she's very grateful for her granddad in particular for bringing her family over from Samoa to New Zealand. On page 306, she says, there was no way I would be pulling on a national rugby jersey with the name Tui on the back and going to the Olympics if Grandad had not brought us all to New Zealand. Wow, I love this. My auntie used to say, we all stand on the soldiers? On the soldiers. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. And so there were people that came before us that created a platform for us to build upon. And she acknowledges the giants in her life here, Ruby does, through showing gratitude to her granddad and her family that brought her over to New Zealand, allowing her to have the opportunities that she's had. And that's not to say she didn't work hard for what she has. She worked unbelievably hard, actually, and maintained really high standards for herself throughout. And that is what we're going to discuss next. Ruby's standards. So throughout her journey, Ruby had standards for what she did and how she did it. And what's interesting is most of the things that she didn't take any talent. On page 133, no, 137, let's have a little look. Yeah, let's look at page 139 first. She says, I kept my word to people and kept it to myself. So that's integrity and keeping your word, and that takes no talent. And then on page 137, she says, every single hour I was busy working, sleeping, eating, or training, and I took pride in what I was achieving. So here she discusses how she was putting herself through uni whilst pursuing her rugby goals, basically working round the clock, working and training and sleeping. And work ethic, again, it doesn't take talent, but it can create talent. But not only that, she wasn't afraid of pushing herself and putting herself in environments that stretched her. She was never afraid of being the worst in the room. Quite the opposite, actually. She would put herself in environments that challenged her. Let's see, on page 170, she says, if you think you might be the best in the room, it might be time to find a new room. So she was constantly seeking out new horizons. She says on page 122, if I'm surrounded by the very best people, I will get better myself. Now, I agree with this with a caveat. With a caveat. So I partially agree with this with a caveat. I think a lot of people assume that if you're around better people, you will get better. But that's not necessarily true. I think you need to be around people who want to get better for you to get better. Because if you're around people who are better but complacent, you don't absorb their skill, you absorb their complacency. So sometimes you're better off being around people who are worse but growing than people who are better but complacent. And on complacency, she says on page 277, if we couldn't find it. Yes, she says, complacency will eat your dreams from the inside out. So that's Ruby's quote on complacency. She was never complacent in anything, in her work ethic, in her character, and the way that she showed up in environments. Everything had a standard for her, especially when things got tough. There was a point where everything was a mess in the team. It was so chaotic. Page 194. The players were unhappy, the staff were unhappy. It was just, everything was collapsing. And she said on page 194, I didn't want to lose me in all the carnage. I intuitively knew that if I just stayed true to who I was, I would survive this crazy storm. Oof. So throughout everything, she stays fundamentally herself. And I think that is a real superpower in helping her navigate her whole career, really. And she really focuses on the soft stuff, the stuff that people sometimes overlook. So there's a point where she discusses traits that are really important to her. She says on page 135 that there are three key attributes to being a good employee, and it applies to team sport as well: skill, reliability, and being good to be around. I think that third one, being good to be around, is probably the most underrated, because whether it's work or teams or whatever, ultimately you spend a lot of time together. So being good to be around just makes things easier, really, and just not creating unnecessary friction. And one of the things that makes Ruby good to be around in particular is her acceptance for people's differences. So on page 250, I believe, have a look here. Yeah, on page 250, she acknowledges that different people have different preparation needs for games. So she says that some players struggle to get aroused enough for a game. They need to do visualization and get pumped up or get aggressive, whereas I'm the opposite. So she acknowledges that she's very different to some players. So some players need to get aggressive, and she's someone that needs to be calm. And then on page 284, when it comes to the Blackburn, she says, everyone's a bit different and we all respect each other's way of doing things. So again, it's that acknowledgement that not everyone is the same. Not everyone has the same temperament. Not everyone has the same needs, but that's okay as long as you respect the way that other people do things. Some people, again, are louder and need constant closeness and intensity. Some people are calmer, need space, need calm. And I think the best teams have both and respect both. So the one thing that stood out to me as well about Ruby's standards was her obsession. She was obsessed. On page 145, you see this in the way that she approaches training. She says, even at training, I'm aware of the score. I ask for the ref the time. I treat it the same as a game. And this is really powerful because a lot of people will get nervous before a game because they were kind of chilled in training. And so the game's the first time they experience intensity or pressure. Whereas if you're taking training just as seriously, then mentally there's no difference between training and a game. And so the games become easier. Um, and then in terms of her approach to training was so fascinating. She set herself challenges. On page 207 and 208, you see the challenges that she set herself in training. So one of the challenges she set herself was to touch the rugby ball every single day for a year. Another challenge she set herself was to never be the first one to let water touch her lips in breaks. And then another challenge she set herself was to train in a beanie and a hoodie and a jacket and in trousers when it was hot to prepare for the Rio Olympics because Rio was going to be really hot. And also, she formulated her own protein shake that was dairy free in the lead up to the Tokyo Olympics, where she won gold. So she was obsessed. And that obsession even applied to refs too. So, page 178. Is it this one? Yes. She says, it's not about the rules, it's about how the rules are refereed. So a lot of people assume that if you know the laws, you'll be all right. But actually, she goes one step further and says, you need to know how specific refs ref the laws. And at her level, there are only a handful of refs that really ref all the games anyway. So it becomes easier to get to know different refs and what they expect and what they like and how they apply certain things and how they interpret certain things. On page 257 as well, it was really interesting. She says, the availability we have is now crazy. I can use Instagram to contact a ref if I want to know more about why they made a particular call. Instagram, DMing the ref later to ask them and find out more information and get to know how they apply the laws. This is obsession, and this is ultimately why she did so well. And she just loved it, and she loved pressure too. On pressure, she says on page 144, she says, people do weird things under pressure in rugby, just like they do in life. So then she made sure to train herself so that her response to pressure was a response that she liked. It was a response that helped her and helped other people around her. And that preparation was super important. On page 257, she says that confidence lies in your preparation. And there's another point in the book where she says that your tackle is either the truth or a lie. So essentially, if you're prepared and you've done the work, then when the pressure hits, your subconscious is already trained. But if you haven't done the work, then it might not work out for you. So essentially, pressure exposes the work that you did or didn't do. So all in all, Ruby had standards for her character, for her work ethic, for the way that she handled pressure, and for how she treated herself and others. And she did a lot of mindset work actually, which probably supported all of these responses. And the mindset work was part of a support system that we're going to discuss now. So Ruby's support system. Support was an interesting theme throughout the book. Injuries, illnesses, setbacks, they all exposed Ruby's underlying support system, or lack thereof at times. So her first major injury was relatively early. And her response here was interesting. She says, I was going to try my best to get back into the Blackburn Sevens, but I was not going to rely on it. My identity had to expand or I knew I was in serious trouble. This was so interesting. So she made sure that she was expanding her life, obviously still playing and enjoying and doing her best on pitch, but expanding her life in general. So she did a communications degree, for example, which proved really useful for later. And she ended up going into broadcasting after her career. And that was, I think, the first piece of her broader support system. And it kept on expanding as different things came up. I mean, later on when she was ill, she woke up in hospital and had a bit of a wake-up call, really. This was page 243. She'd said, in my big effort to show everyone I could play, I had put myself in real danger. I didn't realize that if you don't tell the doctor how sick you are, you could be risking your life. So she was seriously, seriously ill, but was playing it down to everybody because she really wanted to play and ended up hospitalized. And this really exposed that she couldn't do everything alone and had to be honest about her capacity, and ultimately accept and receive help and support, which she did. Because just a couple of pages later, she acknowledges that after I'd reached out to all my people and my resources, I felt fantastic. And that's page 248. So I think by this point, she's now started to assess the support that's around her, whether that's the professional support or familial support, friends, and things like that, which proved to be really helpful for what would come later. So, page 259, she discusses what happened in 2019, where she experienced a lot of abandonment. So, she says that her coach had a major health crisis and had to leave. One of her teammates also left. And thirdly, her partner of 7 years broke up with her. So, it was just a triple whammy. And again, what was most interesting was her response. So, first, she says on page 260, she reached out to her closest friends, drove over to them, and basically just poured her heart out, told them what was going on. Page 261, she says she wrote a lot in her journal as well. And then page 262, she discusses speaking to her sports psychologist. So on her sports psychologist, she says, he gave me a list of things to do to help me through, and he never judged anything I said. Later, she says, each time I explained how I felt to those I trusted, it became easier to do. My friends consoled me, but my psychologist really helped me out too. Both kinds of help are important. So this was really powerful. She finally used a broad range of things as part of her support system, journaling, a psychologist, and also having friends and family, which obviously helps too. And her saying that both kinds of support are important, the professional side and the kind of more loving side, it really stuck out to me because sometimes you need people who love you and sometimes you need people who have the capacity to actually help you. And those two aspects might not come from the same people, and that's okay. Ultimately, throughout her journey, Ruby has learned that no man or woman, in this case, is an island. And this support system that she created ultimately helped her bounce back from things more quickly and ultimately get that gold medal. But I can imagine that by the time she got that gold medal, by the time she stood on the podium, it wasn't about the medal anymore. It was probably about the woman that she'd become along the way. So, in conclusion, Ruby's journey shows us that resilience isn't one big thing. It's lots of little small things, lots of micro decisions that are little threads that create a safety net. Now, some of those threads are internal, so character, mindset, integrity, and some of those threads are external, resources, support systems, professional help. Ruby shows us that resilience isn't something that you're born with necessarily. It's created by the stories you tell yourself, the standards you refuse to lower, and the people that keep you going along the way. They say that pressure makes diamonds, but after reading Straight Up, I'm convinced it can also make rubies. So if you like this book about what separates the best from the rest, you'll probably like this biography by another New Zealand rugby legend, Richie McCaw.